Well, welcome back to In the Word. We are finishing up our week in Jeremiah. It's been really, I think, a really rich week. So we followed Jeremiah in this section, starting in chapter 11, goes through chapter 20, where we talk about the suffering of the faithful. And of course, that chapter ended with Jeremiah being beaten and put in stocks, and really a long, very realistic, I think, lament before the Lord over what's happening to him. When we come to chapter 21, we begin a new section. It goes from chapter 21 through 29. And in this section, we see the Lord vindicating and comforting his people. So God is going to show that what he has been talking about is true. It's going to come to pass, and the people are going to be comforted and given an opportunity to save themselves. We'll see in chapter 21 here. So a new section as we begin, and we see in this section a change. I've mentioned before that Jeremiah is not in chronological order, and that we see that here. The other chapters were warning about the judgment that was going to be coming. This chapter, though, is focusing on the arrival of the judge, the culmination of what God was warning about. God's instrument of judgment, Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, have now surrounded Jerusalem. That's what we see in chapter 21. And Zedekiah is appealing to the Lord. That's how the chapter opens. Let me point out one more thing before we get into the details of the chapter. Sometimes you'll see in this chapter and in other chapters of the Bible the phrases Chaldeans, Babylonians, even the name Nebuchadnezzar are sometimes used interchangeably, sometimes synonymously. So let me just unscramble that a little bit. Nebuchadnezzar is the name of the ruler, the king of Babylon, when they come and invade Israel in 586 BC. This is the final judgment that's brought against Jerusalem and Judea and the tribe of Benjamin. The Babylonians are the name of the people. This is the people of the land that Nebuchadnezzar rules. The Chaldeans now are a name for the leaders of the Babylonians. They're the ruling class. So the Chaldeans are the ruling class of the Babylonians. Nebuchadnezzar is among those Chaldeans. So you'll see that. I don't want to let it confuse you, but you'll see that going back and forth in chapter 21. Now the chapter opens with Jeremiah when King Zedekiah, this is the king that's in power at the end of, just as Jerusalem is being invaded. He sends Pashur and Zephaniah the priest to Jeremiah to inquire of the Lord. So this really shows the role of a prophet in Israel. The prophet was basically the go-between between God and the people. Even the king sometimes but rarely spoke to God directly, or God didn't speak to the king. He spoke to him primarily through the prophets. And Zedekiah is appealing to God. He's hoping that somehow God's going to intervene and drive away Nebuchadnezzar. Why is he doing this? Well, if you remember from 2 Kings, when we went through 2 Kings, Sennacherib, the ruler of the Assyrians, had surrounded Jerusalem in Hezekiah's day. Hezekiah appealed to Isaiah. Isaiah appealed to the Lord, and in 2 Kings 19, verses 35 and 36, we see the forces of Sennacherib miraculously defeated 185,000, turn up dead, and I think Zedekiah is hoping that this is going to happen again. He's looking forward to this deliverance, and so he makes this request. And God replies in verses 3 through 7. So we have one division of Zedekiah turns to God in verses 1 and 2. God's reply to the king in verses 3 through 7, not the reply that Zedekiah was looking for. Look at verse 4. Right away, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, So it seems like God answers him right away. It's a prompt answer and also a shocking answer from God. He says, "Behold, I will turn back the weapons of war that are in your hands, and with which you are fighting against the king of Babylon, and against the Chaldeans who are besieging you outside the walls. And I will bring them together into the midst of the city." So God's going to intervene, all right, but he's going to intervene not against the weapons of the Chaldeans and the Babylonians, led by Nebuchadnezzar, but he's going to turn back the weapons that are in the hands of his own people, Israel. Tells them to retreat, get inside the city walls, where God himself is causing this to happen. Verses 5 and 6, then God goes on. He says he's going to go to war against his own army, the army defending his people. What a shock this must have been to Zedekiah, who was hoping for deliverance. His holy city is going to be reduced. He's going to gather the people there. He's telling them to retreat, and he's going to strike them down. God is going to war. Verse 7, the king, his whole entourage, and all the survivors are going to fall into the hands of a pitiless and merciless enemy. And again, at the end of 2 Kings 25, we see what happens here. The last thing that King Zedekiah sees is his own children being killed. And his eyes then are put out. This is a dreadful, dreadful enemy. So in verses 3 through 7, that's God's reply to the king's request. Now, God is not going to just speak to the king now through Jeremiah. He now speaks to the people in verses 8 through 10. Notice he says, "And to the people you shall say, Thus says the Lord, Behold, I set before you the way of life and the way of death." So in verse 8 here, God is offering two ways for his people. He's offering them a way of escape. Verses 9 and 10. Again, I think a shocking message here. What is the way of escape? The way of escape is to abandon the city and surrender yourself into the hands of the Chaldeans and Babylonians. Why is that? Why such a harsh or a shocking answer? The reason is simple. God's determined the city will be destroyed along with the people in it. This is God's demand, God's decree here. It's going to happen. It can't be turned back. So the best thing that the people can do is flee the city. Starting in verse 11 then is another division. I'd say from verse 11 through 14, we have a message to the royal house of David. So just to recap a little bit, in verses 1 and 2, Zedekiah turns to God. 3 through 7, we see God's answer to Zedekiah. 8 through 10, God's message to the people. And now from 11 through 14, God's message to the whole house of David. Of course, we know from 2 Samuel 7 that God has pledged to keep David's house, his ancestors, on the throne. He's got a warning here for them. He's got a message for them. Verses 11 and 12, he said, "Unto the house of the king of Judah." Notice, to the house, to the whole house. "Hear the word of the Lord, O house of David. Thus says the Lord, Execute justice in the morning, and deliver from the hand of the oppressor him who has been robbed. Let my wrath go forth like fire, and burn with none to quench it, because of your evil deeds." So he's warning them, you better practice justice. This is not just for Zedekiah, this is for the whole house of David. This is a warning that they need to execute justice. Verses 13 and 14 then talks suddenly about the inhabitant of the valley and the rock of the plain. This is a reference to Jerusalem. It's kind of a poetic reference, a figure of speech. He's referring to Jerusalem, and he's saying basically that judgment is coming. And in the light of verses 11 and 12, one of the reasons for this judgment is because of their injustice, the way that they have gone about accepting bribes, giving favoritism to their friends, so forth and so on. So that's the sad sentence that's pronounced on Zedekiah, on the people, and on the whole house of David. How are we to apply this to ourselves during the church age? We're not Israel, but we can learn from Israel here. I think one of the things that we can talk about, one of the things that we can apply is discernment. Discernment about true justice. Now, the world offers us its own version of justice, and we see it regularly in the world. Certain groups, sometimes they're ethnic groups, sometimes they're racial groups, sometimes they're groups that are based on their sexual identification or their sexual preference. These groups often organize themselves, demand, and in some cases are actually given special rights under the law. What are these kinds of rights that they demand or preferences? Well, sometimes in hiring. Some certain groups get preferences in hiring because in the past they've been discriminated against. Sometimes they're protected from, say, high bail amounts or even long sentences because there's some perception that they've been mistreated in the past. They see differences between these groups, and they say, well, these differences must be due to discrimination or prejudice. Also, we see even today that some groups are designated as people who should be receiving payments for injustices that were executed upon their great-great-great-grandparents. As horrible as those injustices were, they're given special privileges, even special payments. That's the world's justice. That's not God's justice. God's justice is colorblind. God's justice is blind to social standing, blind to where people fall into a social hierarchy. Told you that Jeremiah is calling people back to the observance of Deuteronomy, to the covenant. Here's what God says about justice in Deuteronomy 16, verses 18 through 20. This is God's definition of justice. You shall appoint judges and officers in all your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people. Well, how will they do that? It says, with righteous judgment. Well, what does righteous judgment look like? He explains it to us in these verses. Deuteronomy 16, 18 through 20. It says, you shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality. You shall not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of the righteous. Justice, and only justice, you shall follow, that you may live and inherit the land that the Lord your God is giving you. We're not going to receive a land as the church, brothers and sisters, but we see clearly what justice is to God. Justice is righteous in the sense that it is not perverting justice, but applying justice impartially. May we have that discernment, both inside the church and outside the church as well. May we be careful to be impartial in our application of justice. God bless you, brothers and sisters. Have a great weekend. Spend some time reflecting on what you've read this week in the book of Jeremiah. And look forward to next week to another rich week learning from this prophet. God bless you.